Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day three of NADSIN's fifth annual Emerging Leaders Summer Conference. Whitney Lackenbauer, I lead and serve NADSIN as well as serving as a professor at Trent University. Really happy to be moderating the session on personnel today. We've got an amazing duo of presenters, and I'm looking forward to a really exciting discussion afterwards as well, digging into the weeds on a topic that really is, I think, central to what the Canadian Armed Forces and DND has been focusing on for the last 5 years. It's reflected the important work that Marshall and Charlotte are doing and contributing, but also I think represents one of those bottlenecks as we're envisaging what the future actually looks like for the Canadian Armed Forces. So with no further ado, because you're not here to hear me lay things out here, first I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. They can have 15 to 20 minutes to present initial ideas. Very pleased to have two experts with us. First, we have Charlotte Duval-Lantoine, who's the Ottawa Operations Manager and a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She also serves as one of our sibling networks, Triple Helix, as the Executive Director and Gender Advisor. She is the author of the 2022 book, The Ones We Let Down: Toxic Leadership Culture and Gender Integration in the Canadian Forces, 1989 to 1999, which was very deservedly selected as one of the Hill Times best books of 2022. And her research critically examines questions of military leadership, cultural change, and personnel policy. And she really is a subject matter expert sought out frequently by the Canadian news media and was recognized as a 2022 Women in Defense and Security Emerging Leader. So after that, Charlotte, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Whitney. It's a pleasure to be among you, everyone. So I'm very much doing this presentation as the Executive Director and Gender Advisor to Triple Helix. I've been in this position for a little bit over a year now, and basically, and I'll explain the title of my presentation because it's on the nose on purpose. But basically, for the past year and a half, I keep on hearing conversations around capabilities and advanced technology and how they're going to change the way that the CAF operates forever and for the best. The issue that I'm having is that I don't hear the conversation about what it will take for those capabilities to be used to their fullest extent. And we seem to forget that however advanced the technology is, even when we're talking about AI, it's humans that are going to be operating those. There's no way of completely removing humans from the loop, I think, at least in the short term. And so we need to have real conversations. And even if we have advanced technologies that will remove humans from the loop, they are personnel consequences that we need to address if we want to use those capabilities to their fullest and the best way possible for the Canadian military. So why add F-35s and STIR? So basically, from my vantage point, I find that the way we talk about capabilities and their integration, especially when we're talking about digital technologies, we're talking about them the same way that we talked about integrating women in the military. Basically, adding the capability, nothing needs to change, or at least no clear conversation of how things need to change to be successful. And so I'm flipping around the feminist term of adding women and STIR, which is the idea of just letting women join the military and then do nothing for their integration, to talk about the way that we're talking about the F-35. So why the F-35? Well, it's two things. One, we know that we're getting it. The contracts have been signed. Delivery is due. The delivery of the first aircraft is in 2029. If everything goes well, we know that with procurement and delivery, nothing works great, but that's the expectation. So we know it's happening in the near term. We know it's there. And also it has this perk of talking about a physical capability that brings digital capability also on the ground. So as my slide is showing, it's going to bring a new way to conduct operations and warfare and allow me to be this very traditional defense person for a little bit, so that I can give you an idea of what capability and what the F-35 brings to the table, so that we can move towards like asking questions about personnel. So first, the F-35 brings multispectral low observable technologies that allow for enhanced detection, and they present jamming capabilities to deny or delay the enemy's ability to detect, track, or engage the aircraft. If you ask me more questions about this, my answer would be I don't know how it works. So please keep it at this. And then it also has very enhanced diagnostic tools. So basically, you have an aircraft with state-of-the-art stealthy capabilities that not only captures an immense amount of data for operational and tactical purposes, but that also communicates the state of the aircraft and what needs maintenance and repair. So in short, you have an aircraft that can produce operational effects that is also a flying detection system and that can tell you what it needs to function. But what about personnel? There is a little bit of recognition that personnel will play a critical role in the integration and the proper use of the F-35. And I'm quoting two US generals who have been writing about this. They say to achieve success with any fifth generation aircraft requires all personnel associated with the generation and employment of these capabilities to include aircrew, maintenance, and support personnel to optimize their roles in ensuring objective combat operations. This is great. I completely agree. The problem that we're having is that we're not talking about what it's gonna look like and what it needs to look like. So I see ideas floated around in terms of pilot training, talking about the importance of a mix of live and simulation-based training that include realistic scenarios, teach pilots how to deal with an aircraft system that provides a large amount of different information at once. And then we have the issue of clearance that has also been discussed because the F-35 provided so much data that it needs infrastructure, physical and digital. We talk a lot about the secret cloud for storage that require security clearance to access. So it would impact anyone from data analysts and engineers to literally the cleaning crew. And that goes beyond clearance as well, because it requires education and training on how to steward the systems, the data, and the infrastructure properly so that we avoid having we can minimize and mitigate risk and issues down the line. And then let's talk about sustainment and operation of the aircraft. There are some considerations to take into account. And in a way, thank God for the United States to have that lessons learned to give us, even though it's limited. So the F-35 is part of a large program, and it goes to acquisition, training, and sustainment that is led by the US, and that's the Joint Task Force and the Joint Program Office. It means that Canadian fighter forces today need to function in very different ways that they had in the past when working with the CF-18, because now they need to work in step with allies that have acquired the F-35, so the US, Norway, and Australia, for example. And then there's another issue that will need to be confirmed once we have more detail on the contract between Lockheed Martin, Canada, and Pratt & Whitney and the government of Canada. But right now, the US has had some contracting issues, which means that right now it is Lockheed Martin and Pratt & Whitney that decide and that own the maintenance time and schedules for the F-35, which has become a problem for the US, so much so that only 51% of F-35s are currently available for operation at one time, because the personnel has no ownership of when sustainment, maintenance, and when they can get the supply necessary to get these done. So those are big issue already, but then we need to look a little bit further and talk about personnel generation and personnel structure. That is to say, who are we placing in the positions necessary to operate the F-35 and sustain the F-35 properly. And that goes towards operators, but everything also down the chain of command and down the trades within the RCAF, but also support trades are not controlled by the RCAF. So I've had a good exchange with Justin Bronk, who is an air power expert that did a study of the transition plan put in place by the RCAF. And unfortunately, that transition plan is classified, so I cannot access it. But one other thing that he told me was that there are personnel considerations within the transition plan. That being said, it is not certain that people outside of that transition plan team is very much aware of what needs to get done to make sure that the F-35 is operating properly. And then at the same time, the RCEF is pursuing a force structure review, which will look at at the trades and how they're managing them, and see what trade needs more people, what trade needs fewer people, and what trades need to be completely overhauled, and the implication of that structurally. So there's a little bit of hope that things are going to get done here. But the problem now that we're dealing with is that while those situations are fantastic to see, those developments are fantastic to see, while the Canadian military and the fighter force especially are encountering serious readiness challenges. And here I'm gonna try to be as quick as possible, because it's literally something that I could talk about for several hours. And 2 weeks ago, I wrote a 4,000-word Substack post on the matter. So to tell you how extensive we can go into those conversations. But first, we have a lack of aircraft availability due to the CF-18 being past their life cycle, despite having been refitted. So now they need more maintenance, and the supply system is very not fit for purpose within the military, and that creates a lot of delays. And so down the line, that impacts training and operational cycles, that and in turns create unpredictability for both pilot and support staff. Then we have personnel shortages, which are no surprise for anyone here that follows defense even a little bit. But at this juncture, the Air Force is missing about 2,000 people, including instructors and technicians. And most people who are leaving are the ones with the necessary expertise to sustain the fighter force. And we're dealing with all of that while the operational tempo is not changing, which is causing the personnel that is still working with a workload that is constantly increasing without relief. Then you have high turnover personnel that is not managed by this RCEF. Most notably, the fighter force is rife with intelligence officers that are posted there for only 1 year, which means that the learning curve is steep, training and onboarding is intense, and all of these efforts are being repeated less than 365 days later. So it is not helpful to be stuck in this constant cycle of having to train intelligence officers when you actually need them to operate at a high level as soon as they onboard. Then with all of this, you deal with lack of training hours because there's a high attrition among seasoned instructors, lack of aircraft availability. And in addition to that, we have a problem of pipelines towards pilot schooling within the Canadian military, where the schools are unable to process the number of training necessaries to meet the readiness requirements and get the necessary people that they need to be ready and to pursue readiness. And so as long as those problems are not resolved, we're gonna have trust that will collapse in the change of command. There are tales of personnel communicating their struggles with their chain of command, but they remain unheard. There are some observations that senior leaders rely more on their past experience within the fighter force to determine the readiness of their troops and their capabilities, while completely ignoring the reports from their subordinates. There's a question to add to that, and you'll see my expertise in a way shine, is what is the impact on culture? And I think that's a very serious question. Wang and Jaras, two experts in the US military, have written the very fascinating article Lying to Ourselves, where they link issues with readiness with the rise of corruption in the chain of command and unethical conduct. So it's something to follow very closely. So to that, I will conclude with the non-radical idea, but I think we don't talk about it enough, is that readiness is a personnel matter. And we also need to look beyond the operators to make sure that the system structures and generations of personnel are meeting the purpose of the objective. And I think that right now we're not at this juncture. So a lot of work remains to be done. Unfortunately, because of where the F-35 documentation is, I am not necessarily able to access all that data and see where the RCF is going. That's going to be, however, something that we'll dig further into in 2025 when I'm done with 3 book chapters that I have due by the end of December of 2024. While working full time, I am not putting too much on myself. Here is the list of my sources. If you want to access it, you just let me know. Happy to share that with you, including the links. And thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. And I think what we'll do is we'll do the question and answer period more fulsomely after Marshall's presentation. But certainly lots for us to work with there, and I think build on and maybe add some other lenses within your areas of expertise, Charlotte, in terms of some of that work on culture change, gender, and intersectionality, and so on, and how that might also change what type of personnel that we're seeking to recruit. Also look maybe a bit about retention and other topics. But actually, great synergy between your respective areas of expertise. So our next speaker is Major Retired Marshal Gerbrandt, who's a doctoral student at the University of New Brunswick. And his academic work explores adult learning in the Canadian Armed Forces, including military pedagogy, the formal and informal ways that institutional culture is learned, and online learning. Marshall holds an M.Ed in instructional design, where his research explored online learning and quality of life within the Canadian Army. And prior to his doctoral studies, Marshall served as an artillery major in the Canadian Army, where he held leadership positions in both educational and operational units. Marshall, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, so first off, can you see my screen?
All clear.
Wonderful. Okay, so learning is not restricted to the classroom. And I think this is going to build off of a portion of what Charlotte said, because for every new capability that arrives, there is a training remit associated with it. So learning, it occurs outside that class. It occurs in the space beyond formal curriculum. And that is in the hallways, canteens, and other spots people pass through. So today, I want to draw attention to the mundane aspects of physical space and to the objects that often go unquestioned, yet still contribute to the learning experience. And it's in this physical space that a blind spot exists between the Canadian military's values and ethos that are taught in the classroom and the images and objects that surround military members as they move throughout their environment. As I said, my name is Marshall Gerbrandt. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Brunswick. And today I want to talk about space. By considering our physical surroundings and the items which are showcased and displayed, I think there's an opportunity to make visible the forgotten, ignored, and problematic institutional beliefs that might linger in the background. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about military spaces, but these ideas don't just belong there. They extend well outside the military. So do consider your own institutions and places of work, and to what extent maybe this resonates with those spaces. So who am I, right? My military journey, it lasted 20 years. It was filled with a variety of experiences at home, throughout Canada, and elsewhere in the world. These experiences all occurred from a place of privilege, and that privilege extended beyond rank and included all aspects of my identity, which was able, white, cisgender male, and one that conforms to the institutional norms. For much of my career, I thought my experience was the experience. And of course I thought this. From my vantage point, I was able to see myself in my superiors, subordinates, and peers. In every room, I knew that my concerns were being taken care of without recognizing the institutionalized harm this caused. So take this picture, for example. For those that have been to Gagetown, New Brunswick, it's familiar. This statue stands outside the Combat Training Center, and I've walked, ran, and rucked past it countless times. Yet, during much of my career, I never actually thought about it, and who this depicted, and more importantly, who it didn't. And so as an instructor, I do wonder, how did this shape my thoughts on who the ideal soldier was? In 2015, an external review authority, Madame Deschamps, released their report, which re-highlighted longstanding systemic issues related to sexual misconduct, discrimination, and exclusionary practices within the Canadian military. So alongside this report, I progressed in rank, age, and life. And I started to recognize how others experience the military. And so this is my starting point. To many, it's going to come as no surprise that the Canadian military is a gendered or male-dominated institution. To some, this label aligns with their experience or beliefs about what the military ought to be. For those that aren't white, cisgendered, or heterosexual, the gendered nature of the military might represent a place of friction between who they are and what they experience in relation to the institution's espoused culture. A common link amongst these experiences is the physical space in which they occur. So, according to Edgar Sheen, there's 3 levels of culture: artifacts, espoused values, and take it for granted assumptions. They're not distinct entities, and they do blur into and draw from one another. Deeply held and take it for granted assumptions manifest as norms that often go unquestioned by those within the culture. These norms, which influence values and ethos, become more apparent within the visible aspects of an institution's culture. And so, arguably, problematic cultural norms are woven into the CAF as an institution. And Sheen suggested that our understanding of culture influences how we will perceive, feel, and act in that culture. So a disconnect exists between what the military espouses, as seen through Trusted to Serve and the very recently released Fighting Spirit, specifically when we consider what is being represented, if we think of the imagery and what is shown in those documents, and then what is experienced. So with this idea, I'll turn to physical spaces in which we learn and the ways that these take it for granted spaces socialize military members and their values and how they might represent that overlooked disconnect. So as an organization, the Canadian military is responsible for training and educating its membership. Most military members will likely experience 3 types of learning: formal, non-formal, and informal. Beyond occupational training, this includes inculcating members into the institution's ethos, history, and culture through formal learning and informal socialization. It starts in basic training and it continues until you leave. This is where we see individuals, both teachers and students, come together with their own values alongside the institutionally espoused values and beliefs and gendered underlying assumptions. And this can create friction. Caliwick and Groen suggest learning is not a single experience, and scholars acknowledge it's experienced in a variety of different ways. Informal learning, which includes the hidden curriculum, is the most elusive type of learning to identify because it really speaks to the everyday learning that people experience throughout their lives. More specifically, the hidden curriculum speaks to the taken for granted norms of what is generally valued and might contradict what the institution espouses. Further, the ideas contained within a hidden curriculum are often communicated to learners, either from teachers or their peers, indirectly and potentially unbeknownst to those involved. And this draws attention to the mundane or seemingly innocuous ways that physical space within the military education system, but arguably everywhere, represents a gendered hidden curriculum. So identifying space within the military as gendered, it's not new, it's not novel. Andrea Lane explored this idea within the Canadian Special Forces. Matheson and Lyle looked at it within leadership training materials, and Nancy Tabor drew upon her experiences at the Royal Military College and within an operational Air Force squadron to explicate the hidden curriculum. So most likely, aspects of this presentation will be obvious to those who never saw themselves in their surroundings or perhaps felt at odds with the dominant warrior narrative. Yet, by narrowing the focus to the physical buildings and its common spaces, I hope to draw attention to what can be easily and is often overlooked by white, able, heterosexual men who both dominate these spaces while also moving through these spaces without considering how they reinforce a certain way of being and thus impact others. So this disconnect extends beyond people and recognizes the values previously held, or at least institutionally sanctioned, might not represent those currently promoted. So my goal is to show these mundane or maybe seemingly harmless ways that physical space is gendered. To do so, I reflect upon the spaces I occupied as a student and instructor within the Canadian Army and draw upon my experience to understand the ways I experienced and contributed to the reproduction of a gendered status quo. Space and the objects which occupy it resonate in importance. They were conceived by a particular group and they're selected for a reason. Drawing upon Simone de Beauvoir's famous saying about becoming a woman, it can be said, one is not born, but rather becomes, I do wonder if one is not born, perhaps becomes a soldier. And if this is true, what does this statue say? What was it conceived to say? And as an enduring display, how do we walk past it and look up upon it? What does it say to us now? So for many years, I passed it, and it didn't occur to me the ways in which it might influence me as both an instructor and a soldier, and even if only indirectly. And for those that see themselves as othered, existing outside the military hegemony, how do they reconcile what they see displayed with who they are and what they want to be? For those within the hegemony, the instructors and evaluators, how does this statue influence their perception of students? Moving inside, there's an established tradition of exploring the material aspects of education, from desks to whole learning environments. However, a similar critique has not occurred within the Canadian military training and education system. Space is neither universal nor abstract, and Fenwick and their colleagues suggest it's often considered neutral, fixed, and immobile, unrelated to the social. And I think if we consider space neutral, we are making the same mistake when we develop gender neutral policies or other policies that proclaim to be neutral, but perhaps are not in practicality. And so a building's hallways, they serve a vital purpose. They connect where you are to where you need to go. And they provide access to some while restricting entry to others. And so beyond transitioning from one space to another, they provide a place to wait. And that sums up the vast majority of my military experience. And so whatever your job, whatever your purpose, you must move through these common spaces. And here your gaze can't help but fall upon the walls and those items which have been placed upon them. So in contrast to the large statue, photographs on the wall probably seem really mundane. However, it's these mundane or background items that fill space and often go unnoticed unless one stops and actively looks at them. These images socialize those that pass by them. They contribute to shaping what I thought right ought to look like. For me, I perceive them as fact and representative of what the institution believes. But whose experience do they capture and whose do they erase and overlook? Drawing upon Butler's idea of gender in the mundane way they are produced, reproduced, and maintained, I think of these hallways and suggest that as a daily backdrop to formal education, they do influence us, albeit passively, and they influence the beliefs about what we see as ideal or desired. Now, the faces pictured here stare down at all those that pass. They're former general officers whose active service ranged from the highly acclaimed to the more problematic, yet they were all given a second chance to maintain their influence within a position conceived to instill pride in the organization. Sarah Med links this act to displaying leadership as a method of keeping certain bodies in place. And in their research on diversity, likens this to a reproduction of likeness. And while Ahmed's analysis was based predominantly upon race and considered the institutionalization of whiteness, these ideas extend to gender as well. And the spaces occupied by learners and instructors contribute to this informal learning. These spaces, I suggest, must undergo a critical examination if they're to support the organization's goal of creating a space free from hateful and harmful conduct. As a background to daily activities, these spaces are simply there and not necessarily questioned, but they need to be. The spaces occupied by learners and instructors contribute to this informal learning. And when we think of disrupting the status quo, Karen Davis suggests the status quo is rooted in militarized masculinity and the numerous acts of othering that continue to influence culture. And so by drawing attention to these spaces, one can no longer remain a passive occupant. Instead, it brings to the foreground the need to question how the institution's background represents itself and the ways in which these representations align or perhaps subvert institutionally espoused notions of inclusion. And so my purpose here was to draw attention to the mundane aspects of space that likely go unquestioned, and that went unquestioned when I occupied these spaces, but I suggest contribute negatively to learning. The physical spaces where military training and education occurs is a blind spot between what is taught, the curriculum used to teach it, and student experience. And so the image and objects that we choose to display are important. They tell a story of our past, but can also help show what we believe is important moving forward. The series of images depicted here didn't exist during my time as an instructor or student. Yet it still doesn't capture the diversity that actually existed within my occupation during the period that I served. But I think it's a starting point with perhaps more to come. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen.